Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting in 2020 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Can I first of all intimate the apologies of Jackie Bailey for this morning's meeting. The only item on our agenda today is to take evidence from two separate panels of witnesses on the UK Internal Market Bill. First we'll hear from Professor Michael Keating, the Professor of Politics at the University of Aberdeen, George Peretz, who's a QC at the Moncton Chambers, and Dr Dominic de Cogan, who's at the University of Cambridge. I warmly welcome our witnesses to the meeting. I remind members they should direct their questions to a named person. If any of the witnesses wishes to also respond, then please can you request to speak using the chat function. We'll now go straight to questions from the committee, and if I may start, you may be aware that the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, PACAC, at Westminster, commenting on the Internal Market White Paper, stated that it is that to set in law the principles of mutual recognition and non-discrimination will effectively create new reservations in areas of devolved competence. Does the panel agree with PACAC? And does this bill then not potentially provide powers that could significantly undermine the devolution settlement? And if so, given the level of opposition to the bill in both Wales and Scotland, how do we move forward constructively in a way that respects the devolution settlement? And can I ask that question of George Peretz to respond first, please?
Yes. I think I will comment on the first part of that question, which is what the legal effect of the Internal Market Bill is on devolved competence. I think there are really sort of 2 points. The first point is, of course, that devolved competence in the areas that are not reserved was always, of course, subject to EU law, and EU law. EU internal market law imposes considerable constraints on the sorts of matters broadly that are covered by the Internal Market Bill. You will remember in Scotland that the proposal for minimum alcohol pricing, though in the event declared to be compatible with EU law, it was strongly argued by many people for some time that it wasn't. And that's an example of the sort of constraint that EU law imposed. So the EU law, therefore, while we were in the EU, constrained the devolved competences. It is, once you remove, however, the constraint of EU law, it is then fair to say that the Internal Market Bill, in a sense, reimposes and I think reimposes in a different way a number of the constraints that EU law provided for. I think we may come on later to the extent to which the regime set up in the Internal Market Bill differs from EU law. It does so both in substantive content, but also, of course, in terms of the institutional mechanisms, which are, of course, because it's all a UK matter, entirely different. It perhaps helps to think of the Internal Market Bill as a sort of horizontal measure. If one thinks of reserved and non-reserved competences as essentially vertical, the reserved competences are essentially defined areas of law in relation to which the devolved administrations are not allowed to legislate. For example being competition policy. We may discuss what that means later. But the competition policy is a reserved matter, so that none of the devolved administrations will have competence to pass a law that regulates anti-competitive conduct or cartels or monopoly power. That's a matter that's reserved to Westminster. So you have sort of vertical areas of competence. An area like consumer law or environmental protection law is substantially, if not entirely, devolved. So those are vertical competences. If thought of in that light, what the Internal Market Bill is doing is it's essentially a sort of horizontal control, because it reaches into every area of legislative activity. and constrains within each area of legislative activity, it imposes a further constraint. You can, essentially, it's saying to the devolved administrations, you can legislate within an area that is not a reserved competence, but subject to the principles laid down in the Internal Market Bill. It sort of parallels some other, what one might think of as horizontal restraints on devolved competence, such as, and again, this touches on matters we may come on to later, such as the reservation of matters in relation to which the United Kingdom has made an international treaty commitment, because the devolved administrations generally are not competent to legislate in a way that's contrary to the international obligations of the United Kingdom. As to what the political consequences are, I think I'll leave that to others on the panel.
Okay, but Michael Keating, would you like to reflect on that question?
Yes, indeed. I think it does have constitutional implications. As George Peretz has just said, the devolution settlement was based upon the reserved powers model. That is, that some things are reserved to Westminster, everything else is devolved. European matters are also a constraint. But this introduces into the UK system the idea of transversal or horizontal powers, which are very broad-reaching, can reach into almost any competences of the Scottish Parliament. And now it is true that that is how the EU works. And once we come out of the EU, we will not have the EU imposing that framework. The difference is, though, that in the case of the bill, the Secretary of State can change by statutory instrument the exceptions, because there are always exceptions to mutual recognition and non-discrimination and the internal market generally. And this is really the tricky bit. What is the boundary between things that will be subject to mutual recognition and internal market rules, and what will be accepted? Because within the European single market, all kinds of things are accepted. Now, the grounds for exception in the proposed internal market bill are a lot narrower than they are in the European Union. So it's not the same kind of constraint we're talking about here. Also in the EU, the procedure for setting rules is about intergovernmental negotiation, the Council of the European Union, the European Parliament. It's not a case of one level simply legislating unilaterally to impose things on another level. And then there is in the European Union a principle of subsidiarity and proportionality, such that measures can only be taken at the lowest possible level and only be as detailed as necessary. And that can be appealed by member states or indeed sub-state governments under certain circumstances to the Court of Justice. And so the institutional protections that exist in the case of the European single market for member states and indeed devolved governments are not present in this bill. So it does represent a significant change. Of course, the UK has always had the power to intervene in devolved matters, but that's hardly ever been exercised, and it's a power given to Parliament and not to ministers.
Okay, can we move on to a slightly different area? The only thing I've not heard from anybody is how do we sort this? So before I move on to that other area, have any of the panelists a view about how we can move forward in a way that might respect the devolution settlement? What amendments might be required? Michael, you want to pick that up first?
Yes, I don't see the justification for this bill, given that we are having a process of negotiation about policy frameworks. And those negotiations have been going on quite well. All the governments are engaged. This would suggest something that goes beyond these agreed policy frameworks, and it's not quite clear to me exactly what that is. It may be that this single market bill will not amount to very much. Internal market and single market mean the same thing, by the way. It may be that these powers won't be exercised because the frameworks will deal with all these problems. We just don't seem to know, but it seems concerning that such broad powers are being taken without specifying the circumstances in which they might be needed, when I suspect that probably they won't be needed at all.
Okay, thank you. Dominic, you put an R into the chat bar. Would you like to contribute, please?
Thank you. So as a tax lawyer, I was a bit concerned I might have nothing to say in this session, but I have found something, and I'm very concerned about the reservation in section 48 on distortive and harmful subsidies, because when I first read the bill, I thought that tax was excluded from the entire bill. And indeed, you will see exclusions in Schedules 1 and 2. But in fact, I can't see any exclusion for Clause 48. And indeed, in the government white paper, they mentioned a tax break as something that might constitute a distortive or harmful subsidy. I also note that there is no grandfathering procedure, so existing harmful subsidies in the form of tax breaks do not seem to be preserved by the Act. And I just wonder if this is an opportunity perhaps for the Westminster Parliament to interfere with the tax devolution settlement by saying, well, for example, you might have been giving this business rates break, or you may have plans to develop your tax system in this particular way. But in fact, that may constitute a distortive or harmful subsidy, and as it's a reserved matter, we now have a degree of control over that. So I think my recommendation there might be to get tax also accepted from the reservation in Clause 48.
So that's quite a statement, Dominic, and thank you for making it, because that helps us understand some of the challenges. Can I ask beyond that then, if, for instance, and I'm just trying to think within the current basket of powers the Scottish Government exercises, in land and buildings transaction tax or in landfill tax, if the Scottish Government was to move in these areas a way that the UK decided distorted the market, then the principles of the internal market bill would apply, and therefore potentially in these areas or any other area of taxation, the UK government could interfere in what the Scottish Government's taxation policies were.
So I may be overstating, but I think there may be an issue here because the state aid law in the EU is very slippery and it requires a selective advantage. And George Peretz will be able to speak to this better than myself. But depending on how you interpret things, it may be that a tax provision can be seen as selectively advantageous. And that's a very slippery part of law. And this area of law in tax terms being so slippery in terms of people being able to say, well, this tax measure gives a selective advantage. Obviously, we don't know what the new subsidy regime is or state aid regime is going to be within the UK. But I think it's an area worth watching at the very least.
Okay, thank you very much, Dominic. I'm going to bring in George Peretz, and I know that Alec Rowley would like to ask a supplementary, but George, you want to contribute first, and then I'll go to Alec.
Yeah, 2 points really. One, commenting on what each of the previous two speakers have said. First, a point worth making in relation to the supposed urgency of the internal market bill is that Clause 9 of the bill, of course, in a sense, protects anything that exists from the scope of the bill. It's the effect of Clause 9, and there's a corresponding provision in relating to the mutual recognition provision. So, that being so, it is slightly hard to see why Part 1 of the bill, we might come on to the rather more extraordinary bits later, even more extraordinary bits later on, later. But it's hard to see why Part 1 of the bill is urgent, given that fact. It's not. The bill is only going to start biting to the extent that further rules are made in England, in Scotland, and in Wales and in Northern Ireland, as from the beginning of 2021. So the initial bite will be very small. It'll only bite on new things. That makes the urgency quite difficult to understand. As far as frameworks are concerned, one of the starting features of the bill is it makes no reference at all to common frameworks. One has to sort of, being aware as one is that the common framework process is ongoing, the only extent to which that's recognised in the bill at all is implicitly as one basis for the wide powers given to the Secretary of State to essentially to carve out whole areas from the principles of the bill, and one imagines that what's envisaged is that areas that become subject to the common frameworks Secretary of State will then use his powers to carve them out from the bill. But it's a very indirect way of doing that. So that, as to the state aid provisions, of course, what the provisions at the back of the bill do is not in any way to change the, as it were, the sort of substantive law at all. It's simply a matter of assigning subsidy control as a reserved competence. Nothing immediately flows from that. It's a restriction on the powers of the devolved administrations that certainly in my view wasn't there before. We perhaps can come on to that later. But in my view, there was no reservation of state aid or subsidy control in the devolution settlements, and so these provisions are new and pull power back to Westminster. But they only pull power back to Westminster. The government current policy in relation to subsidy control is at the moment to do very little. There's not going to be a new UK subsidy regime that comes into force on the 1st of January. We're promised that there's going to be some consideration of a regime in due course. We are also told that the remainder of the EU state aid regime is going to be wound up. That will leave us with only Article 10 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which itself, of course, is the subject of Clause 43 of the bill in terms of state aid. And the only other development on that front is that if one looks at the new agreement between the United Kingdom and Japan, the United Kingdom has entered into commitments to Japan in relation to subsidy control that, in my view, will require legislation because they prohibit certain kinds of subsidy completely to the extent that they affect trade with Japan. And then I think will require legislation, and that I suspect may be the first bit of legislation that's that employs that is based on the reserved competence that's going to be taken. Although I note that because that's contained in the international agreement, the UK government could probably have done it anyway on the basis that it was necessary to implement the international agreement.
Thanks. George, can I bring in Alec Rowley for that supplementary now? Alec?
Yeah, Bruce, I wanted to go back to the point that Professor Keaton made, where he said that this bill might not be ever used. But the concern that I think that I have is that the change of government from the May government to the Johnson government seemed to signal a significant shift in policy. Things like the common frameworks, which the devolved administrations were fully participating in, seem to have been put to the side. So there's less interest in that. And my fear, therefore, is could this bill be the foundations of future trade where, for example, the UK government sign up to a trade deal with the USA and then they are able to enforce goods to be sold in Scotland, but worryingly, they also could start to enforce companies being able to get in about public services, so that public services could be privatised by the back door. And specifically on the question that the convener asked about possible amendments, I note in your paper you say that there is no subsidiarity or proportionality within the UK devolution legislation. If we were to move towards that UK framework, which the principle of subsidiarity and proportionality was built into it, is that a possible amendment to this bill?
Who do you want that to go to first, Alec?
Professor Keaton.
Okay, thank you.
I think it was addressed to me. I was struck by a phrase in the internal market white paper which says the UK is a unitary state. Now that's just a phrase, but it needs to be unpacked a little bit. Is it a unitary state, or is it something like a federal kind of system? That's a big philosophical issue that is not resolved here. On the frameworks, yes, the frameworks I understand are still proceeding. We haven't had any finalized, but there's a lot of technical work going on there. On the last point of your question, the critical thing here is what is exempted from mutual recognition or harmonisation. That's absolutely crucial. Yes, it would apply in the case of trade deals. If standards were recognised by the UK government in respect of England, then that would also apply to the rest of the United Kingdom, irrespective of local regulations. What is accepted? Now, in the bill there, it says health and social services are not part of this. They're not part of mutual recognition. They would be exempted. But apart from that, we don't know very much. There's a very narrow clause that talks about public safety and public health. But apart from that, we don't know very much. And as I said before, the corresponding clause in the EU internal market is really quite broad. It talks about general public policy grounds. It would cover things like the environment. It would cover things like ethical questions, which are not covered in this rather narrow UK exception there. And then, of course, the bill does give the Secretary of State, by affirmative resolution in Parliament, the power to change those there. So it does put a lot of power in the hands of UK ministers to do things that otherwise would be constrained. This is the nature of our devolution settlement. Parliament can give ministers these powers, and it proposes to do so. But it certainly changes the way that devolution has worked hitherto. As for subsidiarity and proportionality, yes, they are important in the European Union, and they're particularly important because they can be enforced by the courts. But we don't have anything like that in the UK settlement. The Supreme Court can rule on the validity of acts of the Scottish Parliament, but not on the validity of acts of the Westminster Parliament. And in certain circumstances, they can rule on the use of powers by ministers. But again, that's constrained. So I'd like to see a lot more detail about the kind of safeguards that are being put in here, not relying on the goodwill of UK ministers. I'm not questioning their good intentions, but we need something that would bind this and future governments by a clearer set of rules which can constrain what they're doing, thereby safeguarding the prerogatives of the devolved administrations and legislatures.
Okay, I had a second area of questions I wanted to ask about, but before I do that, I'm going to bring in Murdo Fraser, because actually his question that I think he wanted to ask is in this area also. Murdo?
Thank you, Convener. It's really just a follow-up to the question from Alec Rowley to Michael Keating, and it's around this issue about impact on devolved services, and specifically the comment about the NHS. Now, when I'm looking at the bill, there are specific exclusions in Schedule 2 to both mutual recognition and to non-discrimination, which include a whole range of services, including provision of healthcare. So I just wonder, is it not the case that the bill as it stands does actually ensure that the NHS in Scotland is exempted from these provisions?
I think so. I believe so. You have to get the lawyer to confirm that, the wording of that, but I believe so. But there are things around the health service, like the provision of medicines, for example, that maybe are in a grey area there. But certainly the government has recognised that health and services are a government responsibility, and broadly speaking, they would not be subject to the bill.
Okay, thank you. And if I could maybe ask one other question again, because Alec Rowley touched on this, and maybe ask it to yourself, Professor Keating, and also bring in the other panelists if they want to comment. And that is there a fix to this? If the concern is that there is an impact on devolved powers, is the fix to this to build in a proportionality provision that would in effect reflect what is in the current EU law, and put that in this bill? Would that in effect cure the problem?
That could be the case. Now, what would be required then was some impartial authority to make a judgment or give advice about it. The Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, is involved here in an advisory capacity to the UK government, but it is appointed by and responsible to the UK government. Now, I and my colleagues on various occasions have said it would be useful to have some kind of independent body in the intergovernmental arena to give advice about these things, to do the analysis, and that body would be responsible to all the parliaments of the United Kingdom and not just the UK government.
George Perez, I think you wanted to come in as well.
Yes, just a couple of observations. I mean, one point on the exclusions in Schedule 2, which is worth making generally, is that the Secretary of State has power to add and take away from those exclusions. So those, and to do so by regulations. One finds that in Clause 15, I think, from memory. Yeah, Clause 16, Clause 16.2 gives the Secretary of State power to remove or add. So the sort of heft, the weight of said Schedule 2, I think, has to be seen in the light of the fact that the Secretary of State can, by regulation, adjust it. So I think that's the first point. I mean, the second point, just to, as Professor Keating was saying earlier, this is one of the differences between this regime and the regime of EU law, is that what one might think of as the public policy justification is much narrower, restricted essentially to public health and safety, whereas EU law recognises all sorts of other factors as potential public policy justifications, including environmental factors, animal welfare. I mean, an example I've used myself in thinking about this is an example that actually comes from EU law. There's a EU law provision which will become retained EU law on the 1st of January that prohibits the sale of cosmetic products that have been tested on animals. Now, that prohibition has nothing to do with public health or safety. Nobody is saying that cosmetic products tested on animals are any more or less safe for humans. The objection to their sale is an animal welfare objection. And if it were contemplated in future by the UK government acting for England, that regulation might change, and it might change, for example, as a result of a trade agreement, because certain countries do not have that objection to cosmetics products being tested on animals, then under the bill, it doesn't seem to me, under the mutual recognition principles of the bill, it doesn't seem to me that the devolved administrations would have any capacity to stop that. So that's perhaps an example of the sort of issue you get into. Now, one might hope politically that something like that would be resolved through a joint framework, but there's nothing in the bill that requires that.
Tom Arthur, I think you had a supplementary in this area as well before we move on to different aspects.
Thank you, Convener. My question was for Mr. Peretz. It just it's in relation to Clause 16.2. Clause 16.4 allows for the Secretary of State to make regulations under the affirmative resolution period for a period of up to 3 months, beginning with the day the part of the bill or the Act would come into force. But it doesn't specify in Clause 16.4 that this is for ancillary or saving or transitory reasons. Is there significant policy implications behind Clause 16.4, or do you think this is just really a contingency power to deal with anything it may, for any unknowns that could crop up after the Act came into force?
Yes, I mean, I'm afraid I don't know what the justification is for that. You're quite right that the resolution, the affirmative resolution procedure, it doesn't apply for the first 3 months. It's only the made affirmative resolution procedure. I'm afraid I simply don't know what the thinking behind that is, other than there is perhaps thought that they may need to make a number of regulations rather more quickly during the first 3 months. But I think you'll have to ask the UK government what the justification for that is.
But just so I can understand clearly, they could move, for example, health services. The UK government could remove health services from the schedule without immediate parliamentary approval.
And that must be right. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
I mean, the made affirmative resolution does leave Parliament with the ability to do things, but it requires it to take an initiative. So it's yes, but I think you're right. The check on the UK government's ability to do that is, I think, a political rather than a legal one.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you, Mr.
Okay, listen, the second area that I wanted to ask a question was in regard to Clause 46. which creates a new power for ministers to provide money directly to anyone, including organisations working in devolved areas. Michael Keating states in his paper that UK ministers are given wide powers to spend in devolved fields. This changes the previous assumption that they would only spend in the reserve fields, and that with a few exceptions, financial transfers to the devolved administration would go through the block allocation, governed by the Barnett formula. Is there not a risk then that could, by changing the established way devolution is funded, as set out in the bill, then this brings into question the whole premise of the Barnett formula, which is in itself mechanistic and therefore not subject to the whim of UK ministers? And perhaps I could go to Michael Keating on that first.
Yes, it does. Of course, the Barnett formula is not statutory either. It's just a rule of thumb that the Treasury adopts, and we gradually found out the details over a period of 40 years of how it actually worked. But certainly it does. Now, UK ministers have been spending in the devolved territories increasingly on small things, people's programme and other measures. They can do it, but it's never been done systematically. Now, we don't know what this clause is for. It may be just to deal with the proposed Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the UK government's proposed replacement for the EU cohesion and structural funds, in which case it's a relatively small matter and much bigger in Wales and Northern Ireland than in Scotland. But once again, we just have to take their word for it that that's what it's all about, because potentially it's a very far-reaching power. And this became a huge issue in Canada. They call it the federal spending power, a major provocation that the federal government was stepping on devolved, or I should say provincial competencies, which went through the use of the spending power. It may not have the power to legislate in those fields, but it can spend and therefore get its own way. From a public policy point of view, there are also tremendous concerns about this, because it doesn't always make for good public policy if you've got two governments spending in the same field and not necessarily sharing the same objectives. It also creates scope for enormous arguments. If the UK government is spending here and there around the UK, we want to know who wins and who loses. The Barnett formula may not be terribly logical because it's based on historical patterns of expenditure, but at least it's fairly transparent. At least we now know how it works. Now, it's much more difficult if UK ministers are simply spending on what might appear to be political or other grounds, how that adds up. So I think it's a worrying development that governments would be given those powers.
Dominic, I know it's a tax area in particular your expertise is in, but given this is to do with financial matters, do you want to make any comment, or am I on this area?
I think this is really a question for David Bell, who's coming up in the next session. I assume that this would not change the allocation under the Barnett formula. That's really for others to answer, but that would be my question.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I move on then? In that case, Angela Constance, please.
Thanks, convener, and good morning to the panel. My first question is to Professor Keating. And Professor, you talk a lot about the reserved model of power, and in your paper that you sent to committee, you talk about the two interpretations of the UK. One interpretation being it's a unitary state that merely lends powers to devolved administrations, with the other interpretation being that we're a union of nations. But given the sweeping powers that could affect standards in food safety, animal welfare, given clause 46 that the convener spoke about in terms of UK ministers designing replacement EU programmes in devolved areas, given what we've heard about clause 48 and the reserving of state aid, I wonder, how is this compatible with the current devolution settlement, or does this just exemplify the weakness with the current devolution settlement?
It exemplifies the ambiguities of the current devolution settlement, because phrases like unitary state, anybody can use them. We're not a federation, that's clear, but are we a federal kind of system? This vocabulary was used after the 2014 referendum. There'll be a federalizing process. My point really is not an argument about semantics, but an argument about whether the devolution settlement should be seen as a constitutional settlement. That the Scottish Parliament is not just a local government, it is a parliament with its own powers, its own competences, and these should be respected. Now, how you get to that, short of a complete federal system and a written constitution, I don't know. But at least when the issue comes up, as it does in these cases, then I think it's appropriate to say, well, these powers are premised on the assumption that we're a unitary state, and they ignore the fact that there is a constitutional settlement in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It's really the spirit in which we understand devolution rather than arguing about the precise words. Now, of course, a lot of this is political. We know that the UK government, for perfectly understandable reasons, feels that it's spending a lot of money in Scotland and not getting the credit because the money is handed over to the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish government then spends it at its discretion. So it's a lot of it is about visibility. And that's, as I say, that's perfectly understandable because the UK government does spend a lot of money in Scotland. But it does raise the danger that a lot of the spending is going to be guided by this kind of political considerations of who gets the credit for this and that. This is my experience of what happened in Canada. And it doesn't necessarily make for good public policy, nor does it make for clarity about who's responsible for what.
I mean, I suppose that's just a fact of life. I mean, the Scottish Government may complain that the funding and policies that local government benefit from, that we don't always get the credit for that. But I wanted to pick up on a point that Murdo Fraser had raised, and I had wondered if Professor Keating and the panel felt that actually the nub of the issue here is not so much about the allocation of competencies, but how competencies and powers are actually exercised at the end of the day, and whether or not the biggest threat or the biggest threat to the erosion of devolution is actually in and around mutual recognition, which is a very different thing to how the current European single market works, and whether or not the danger with mutual recognition, given that devolved administrations appear to have limited opportunity to refuse mutual recognition on the basis of public interest, is the danger here that the biggest part of the UK will dominate constitutionally and economically.
So, listen, also we had Dominic wanted to come back in on some of the questions that Angela was asking, and George Peretz as well. So I'm going to go to Dominic in the initial phase of the answers to the questions that Angela's been asking, and I realise Angela's taken the question on a bit, and then I'll come back to Professor Keating because I'm not sure that you directed it specifically to somebody that question, Angela. So I'll go to Dominic first.
I did. I directed it to the panel.
So who was it you directed it to? Apologies.
I directed it to all the panel.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Let's start with Dominic then. Right.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'll nobody.
I just wanted to make a really short point in response to Professor Keating's comment on federalism, which is to say that in countries where you've got formalised fiscal federalism systems, such as Canada, Australia, Germany, you can, if necessary, go to court to preserve the proper function of each part of the territorial constitution. So, for example, if the centre were to encroach on the devolved administration's powers, that's something that could be adjudicated, and to a much greater degree than we can under our own system. And I just wonder, I mean, these provisions in the bill seem to indicate a lack of trust, because if there was trust between all the different administrations, you wouldn't need legislation to deal with all of this stuff. And if that's the case, you know, if I were sitting in Scotland I would be asking for similar formalisation of the actual fiscal settlement as well, so that if necessary, it could be taken to court. Now, of course, you still remain vulnerable to the exercise of parliamentary sovereignty, but that's fundamental.
George, and then Michael.
Yes, I have a couple of comments. One, just to pick up a point in relation to the funding provision in clause 48, I think, that we were talking about earlier. One point also to remember is if the UK decides not to have any system of domestic state aid control, then that will also free the UK government to be spending in the devolved areas, to be, in a sense, handing money out to companies in the devolved areas pretty freely and without any control by the devolved areas as to who gets that money. And so that has implications as well. In terms of the sort of constitutional points that we were discussing earlier, I mean, I wrote a piece for Prospect magazine in commenting on the white paper, but I think it applies equally to the provisions of the bill. That in many ways, from the perspective of the devolved administrations, the internal market bill is a bit like being invited to participate in a game where the UK government, because it is also the English government, is by far the strongest player. It obviously is in terms of population, but it's not only the strongest player, it's also the umpire, because in many respects it decides what happens, but it's also, and one finds these provisions throughout the bill, has the power to rewrite the rules whenever it wishes to. And finally, of course, because of the power of the unfettered sovereignty of Westminster, if ever the internal market regime ever disadvantages the UK, is ever a nuisance, pretty colloquially, to the UK government legislating for England, it can simply override it using Westminster's unfettered sovereignty. That's not something that the devolved parliaments can do. Now, how one addresses that within the framework that we have got, constitutional framework we've got, which is not a federal framework in the sense that the powers of the UK government and the powers of the UK government acting as the English government are constrained and set out in law and subject to control by the courts. And it's, in a sense, a fundamental provision of the UK constitution that it isn't so. How within that framework one entrenches the position of the devolved administrations is, I think, a difficult one, and it goes really beyond the scope of the internal market bill. Once we're talking about a very different type of constitution. I think within the scope of the constitution we've got, what one would be looking for is, I think, some much more express recognition of common frameworks. One would be looking for the powers that the Secretary of State has to be exercisable only after at least certain safeguards have gone through in terms of at least consultation with the devolved administration, the devolved administrations, and perhaps some process like that. There are various other things one could imagine that would make the internal market, would in a sense offer within the current settlement protections to the devolved administrations but those protections simply aren't there.
Michael, do you want then to finish off that section before we go back to Angela? Angela?
Just one final question, Convener. Although the bill says that there may be exclusions from the principle of non-discrimination, the explanatory notes say that the bill will, I quote, provide the Secretary of State with a power to alter these exclusions to retain flexibility for the internal market system in response to changes in market conditions. So, in other words, they can do what they want. I wonder if Professor Keating or Mr. Perez would comment on that.
Yes, what is missing from this bill is a consent provision. We have the Sewell Convention with regard to primary legislation. It doesn't apply to statutory instruments. That's always been somewhat problematic. It's been extended to statutory instruments in the EU withdrawal bill in a limited way. But the principle of consent is something that I think should inform this discussion. What form it takes, we know that the Seoul Convention is not legally binding, but at least it's something, it's an expectation there. And what we're seeing in this white paper and the bill is the principle of consultation, which is not quite the same as consent.
Mr. Perez?
Yep, I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay. Angela, thank you. I'll move on to Dean Lockhart.
Thanks very much, Convener. I would like to follow up on the question of how and when this legislation might apply to trade in the internal market, because as we've heard, both the UK Government and the Scottish Government intend for common frameworks to be the cornerstone of the internal market. In fact, I think the Scottish Government anticipates 6 common frameworks being in place by the end of the year, and a number of regulatory frameworks also being in place. Given this background, can the panel give a general sense of what residual powers might be left over in terms of what might be left over to be governed by the internal market legislation? And could we see a scenario, if the common frameworks are in place, where the internal market proposals would only really apply to a relatively small number of trading arrangements which are left outside of the common frameworks? And perhaps I could ask Professor Keating to kick off on that question.
Yes, it may do. As I said before, we don't quite know what the scope of these powers is going to be in practice. If it's just kind of reserve powers to be used if nothing else works, then I don't see the justification for giving the Secretary of State sweeping powers just on the trust that it's only going to be used to fix the odd anomaly there. I think if that's what we're talking about, the frameworks process, because it is a process, frameworks will continue to be renegotiated, would probably be a better vehicle for that, because at least this is about negotiation and consent. I suspect, and again we don't know, that the main reason for taking these powers back in such a sweeping way is to do with trade deals. And that's why the schedule of exceptions might have to be accepted to take account of the new trade deals. That really raises the question of what the role of the devolved administration should be in trade deals, how open trade deals should be. But once again, we're contemplating here giving ministers sweeping powers without really knowing the extent to which these powers are going to be used in practice.
But before I hand over to the other members of the panel, but if the common frameworks in place, which cover a whole range of sectors, agriculture, fisheries, labelling and other areas, we are left, in terms of what the internal market proposals might apply to, a relatively limited set of powers in the future, and possibly because those powers are not specified right now, it makes sense to have a sweep-up mechanism in the form of the internal market proposals to deal with issues outside of the frameworks that might come up in the future.
Well, except that the frameworks are not constitutionally entrenched. They can be changed by the UK Parliament at any time. And some of them will be legislative, but this will be Westminster legislation with legislative consent. So the constitutional implications are quite different.
Okay, perhaps I could ask other witnesses to get their views on this question.
George, you want to kick off?
I mean, I'd add the observation as a lawyer that one of the things one always has to ask oneself if one's in a negotiation, so the sorts of negotiations that will take place within the common frameworks between the devolved administrations and the government. As a lawyer, the question one always asks oneself when one's engaged in negotiations is what happens if the negotiations break down? Because that's a critical question that governs the way in which the negotiations proceed. And it obviously affects the relative strength and weakness. It greatly affects the relative strength and weaknesses of the parties in those negotiations. The question of what happens when if the negotiations break down. And I think from a Scottish or a Welsh or Northern Ireland point of view, the difficulty here is that the way that the bill is structured means that if the framework negotiations break down, effectively the Secretary of State can legislate in a way that gets him what he wants. And given that background, that will greatly affect the way in which the framework negotiations are conducted, because if you have the power to get what you want, even whatever happens in the negotiations, that greatly affects what you say and what you do in those negotiations. If, on the other hand, you know that if negotiations break down, you're going to get a result you don't like, that again will affect what you say in the negotiations. So, though the frameworks, in a sense, may sort of take place first with the legislation as a fallback, the fact that this legislation is there is going to affect the framework negotiations.
Now, I don't know if, Dominic, you want to pick up on any in that area. I'm not sure it's your area of expertise, but let us know.
Well, I think I would only say that, as far as I know, there is no common framework on tax. And indeed, you wouldn't expect there to be one, because the kind of tax competences being repatriated are VAT, those kind of things which would not be expected to be devolved competences anyway. However, if it is true that there are gateways in this Act for the introduction of tax issues, such as Clause 48, or by the Minister amending the exceptions in Schedules 1 or 2, then I don't think tax would be covered by a common framework, so would stay within the scope of the Act.
Well, there's actually, in terms of VAT, there was an earlier proposal for a form of assignment of VAT to the Scottish Parliament. So, yeah, I guess now that VAT is no longer a competence which is controlled by the European Union, there's more scope for greater devolution in that area in future. Would that then become an issue where potentially there'd be a common framework around VAT matters?
Exactly. I mean, what I'm saying is that I think there are gateways within this bill for the introduction of tax issues, and I don't believe there is currently a framework. Of course, an assignment of revenues is just paying across a certain sum of money, rather than deciding about zero rating or exemptions or anything. But certainly, if devolution were to go further, then it may become an issue.
Dean, I don't know if you'd completed.
Kabir, I'd like to ask another question on a slightly different topic, because I think one of the witnesses mentioned, I think it was George Perez, mentioned the free trade agreement or the economic partnership that the UK government has just signed with Japan. And I wondered if he had sufficient knowledge of the process there or the outcome to let us know if that economic partnership, which goes beyond the existing EU-Japan free trade agreement, if that had any impact on the devolved settlement, or if that resulted in any lowering of standards on the UK side?
I'm afraid, as far as I'm aware, and when I last looked, the text of the agreement has not yet been published, so that makes the question slightly difficult to answer. What I understand, and this I'm afraid the source for this is a story in the Financial Times, but I think a fairly well-sourced story, and this was the source of my comments earlier about the subsidy provisions. What I understand is that the subsidy provisions in the UK-Japan agreement are simply rolled over from the existing subsidy provisions in the EU-Japan agreement. Although in the UK they will require legislation, in the EU they didn't, because the EU complies with those provisions anyway because of its own state aid rules. But I'm afraid that's all I know about the UK-Japan agreement, and I think I'm afraid I'd have to park that question until the text of the agreement is actually released. I simply don't know, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, Camille. That's all I had, Camille. Thank you.
Okay, I now go to John Mason. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Convener. And if I could just maybe pursue a little bit more, especially with Mr. Peretz, about the question of the common frameworks and the bill. I mean, Mr. Peretz, you made the point that if the common framework discussions came apart, then it would resort to the bill. But assuming there is a common framework, what is the relationship between the common framework and the bill? And I mean, we've had the case, for example, the whisky industry went to court about minimum pricing. So would they go to court? Could they challenge the common framework in any way?
As far as I can see, I mean, the problem of the bill doesn't actually explain what it, because it doesn't make any reference at all to the common frameworks. But yes. What I think the thinking must be is that if there's a common framework agreed, then the Secretary of State will then use his powers to add to the schedules, to cut back on the, to add to or to cut back on the scope of the principles set out in the bill, to make sure that the as it were, the subject matter of those common frameworks is carved out of the scope of the bill. Now, if that happens, then an entity that thinks to itself, well, if we had been able to go to court and ask it to apply the non-discrimination principles or the mutual recognition principles, we think we would have won. But now we can't, because this regulation takes this particular issue outside the scope of the bill. What scope would it have to challenge the regulation, effectively with the regulation making power of the Secretary of State? Well, I think the answer would be with the usual judicial review principles. I mean, there's no ouster clause here. An ouster clause is an attempt to protect regulations from the scope of judicial review. There's a very dramatic one, which one finds in clause 45. But in relation to the regulation powers we've been talking about so far, there's no such ouster clause. So it would be the standard grounds of irrationality, excess of powers, and so on. In practice, I suspect it would be quite hard to challenge such regulations, and I think particularly against a background of an agreed common framework. But I certainly couldn't say it would be impossible for an entity to do that, but you'd have to look at the particular regulation and see. And for example, I mean, if it prescribed things that just looked absurd, then one might have an irrationality challenge.
So would the common frameworks always be in the form of regulations? Would they ever be in legislation themselves?
They could be in legislation itself. I mean, if the common framework was dealt with by simply passing an act at Westminster, which then got legislative consent in the relevant devolved parliaments, then that, of course, that technique would be effectively immune to judicial challenge, because an act of the Westminster Parliament is not subject to judicial scrutiny of any kind.
Okay, thank you. My other area was probably more from Michael Keating, although I want to come back on the previous point as well. But it was around this area of legitimate aims, and where we do have, the Scottish Parliament has more power to control things. And in his paper, in your paper, Mr. Keating, you mention protection of life, health, humans, animals or plants, and the protection of public safety and security. And I was just wondering, I mean, can you expand on that a little bit as to just how much freedom does the Scottish Parliament have in these areas?
Well, my point was this clause is very narrowly drawn compared with the relevant European clause, which I also quote in the paper that you mentioned there. This area is highly controversial. There's been a whole lot of cases at the European Court of Justice patrolling the boundary between areas that are exempted and areas that are part of this. Now, this is going to be given eventually to the courts in the United Kingdom, but they don't have a lot of experience with this, except in fact in relation to EU law, because we don't have these kind of regulations within the UK itself, because the EU has looked after that. So your point was about the meaning of this. One could think, for example, of the Scottish government wanting, or Parliament wanting, to ban a product that was not harmful to human safety. GM crops, for example, hormone-treated beef, it may not be harmful to human or even animal safety, but there may be other reasons, environmental reasons, ethical reasons, social reasons, which could be brought to bear. But if a case came before the UK courts, all that could be pleaded were these very narrow reasons. And I think that's problematic. That is not how it works in Europe. In Europe, yes, it goes to court. There's a lot of negotiation, a lot of debate, and gradually the boundaries are drawn between those things that should be subject to the market and those things that could be subject to public regulation. This is still going on. This process has been going on since the European community were founded, especially since the single market programme in the 1990s. And the bill and the white paper here seem to suggest that's a rather straightforward matter. Well, it's not. It's very difficult and it's very political.
Right, thanks. I mean, earlier on, Mr. Peretz had suggested that, for example, products tested on animals would not be a sufficient grounds, despite the fact that animal health is part of the issue. I mean, do you agree with what he said on that?
Well, I don't know, but it seems to me that would be precisely the kind of issue in which we get disagreements and legal uncertainties, and things could end up in the courts.
Okay, thanks. And I mean, we also had a paper from Professor Dugan at the University of Liverpool, and he was talking about minimum alcohol pricing. And I think his understanding is that the existing agreement or regime would stay in place, but if we tried to increase the unit price, that it would be open to challenge. I mean, again, is that just an unknown, or is that something you've got a view on?
It seems to me what he's saying is right. Yes, he's a lawyer and he knows the legal interpretation better than I do, but that seems to be fairly plausible. Yeah.
Okay, that's me, convener, unless Mr. Peretz wants to say anything.
Correct. I was going to ask if George wanted to contribute to that.
Yes, I mean, I think a point I would make about animal health is that one has to look very carefully at what Schedule 1, how Schedule 1 actually defines animal health, and it's certainly not obvious to me that it would extend to the sorts of concerns that are the basis of the cosmetic provision, the cosmetics regulations so I'm looking at it now, that we were talking about earlier. I'm just trying to find the relevant provision in Schedule 1 that deals with animal health. It's really about, certainly as I read the schedule, it's not so much about general concerns about animal welfare, but more about the sorts of concerns that led to, that are behind, for example, foot and mouth and BSE bans on movement of beef and cattle and so on. It's threats to animal health in that it's pests and diseases that are covered, and not sort of animal health rather more widely. And in any event, one might have an argument about the extent to which the absolute blanket ban in the cosmetics regulation on any testing on animals whatsoever is necessary to protect animal health, because one could argue that not all testing of cosmetics is particularly harmful or distressing to the animals concerned. One can imagine some forms of testing that are not. As I understand the basis of that provision, it's not so much, but it is obviously partly a concern about pain and suffering and so on, but it's also a general blanket ethical objection to the idea that cosmetics should be tested on animals, whether or not there is any real suffering on the animals concerned. And so far as that's the motivation behind the blanket ban, I think that would be very difficult to fit into an animal health exception. I also, as I said, I read Schedule 1 as rather more narrow in terms of how it defines animal health than that.
Right, thanks very much.
But Michael is right. One can imagine lawyers spending much profitable time arguing about these things.
Okay, John?
Yes, thank you.
Patrick Harvey, please.
Thank you, convener, and good morning to our witnesses today. There's been quite a lot of discussion already about the relationship between this bill and common frameworks. I wonder if I could just press you both a little further on that. The position of the UK government is clearly that this bill is not only necessary but urgent. The position of the Scottish government is that this bill is entirely unnecessary and that common frameworks approach are capable of dealing with everything that needs to be addressed. notwithstanding the comments in Michael Keating's paper that say there is no single well understood definition of what an internal market is, either globally or in this bill, is it your view, each of you, perhaps Michael Keating first and then George Peretz, that the operation of the UK's market economy can be secured and safeguarded adequately with the common frameworks approach and without this bill or anything like it? Are you closer to the Scottish Government's view that this bill is simply unnecessary, or do you take the UK Government's view that this bill is necessary and common frameworks cannot be an adequate resolution to these issues? Michael Keating first and then George Peretz, if that's okay.
Yes, I would want to give common frameworks a go. We still don't know exactly what they look like, but the process of negotiating has been surprisingly constructive, really, considering the level of political conflict between the governments. Once it comes down to the details of issues, there seems to be a fair degree of consensus to what is needed. If something else comes up, I think it would be better and more consistent with our constitutional settlement to go on negotiating to expand common frameworks where necessary. And even though these new internal market powers may not be used on a wide scale, there's a matter of principle here that these things should be negotiated. That's how devolution has worked so far. So I'd be hesitant from a constitutional perspective in giving UK ministers such wide powers and just trusting that future UK governments are not going to abuse them.
And George Peretz?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would add to that, 2 points. One, I think I've made the point already, but it's very hard to see the urgency of Part 1 of this bill, given that it doesn't apply to legislation that's going to be enforced which is enforced on the 31st of December. So it only applies to new legislation. And by definition, there won't be, certainly for the initial few months, much new legislation. The vast majority of rules that affect the sale of goods will be old legislation. So that I think makes the urgency justification a bit thin. I think my only footnote to what Michael said about common frameworks is yes, it's obviously a good idea to try and, within the settlement that we've got, to try and negotiate frameworks between governments. But I return to the point I made earlier. As a lawyer, one's always interested in what happens when the negotiations break down. And I think there is a need for something to be there if negotiations break down. There is, at least in theory, the possibility of quite serious interferences with the operation of the UK internal market, however one approaches what an internal market is, as a result of the very wide powers that the devolved administrations have. And of course, the UK government, including as the English legislator, has. One composite slightly fanciful examples of attempts to ban all products from another part of the UK, or either expressly or effectively, though not expressly, by provisions that in effect have that effect. These aren't fanciful risks. If one looks at the EU case law over the last 40 years, you can see ways in which member states have on occasion tried to legislate in ways that are designed to protect their home market against things coming in from other member states. And they've used all sorts of clever wheezes to do so, not necessarily expressly saying products from Germany are not allowed in our market, but so setting up regulations that make it very difficult for products in Germany to be sold in their market. So there's clearly a risk here. How one evaluates the risk is a political judgment, but there is a risk, is undoubted.
Yeah, I take the point. I can't think of an example where devolved powers have been used in that way for that kind of purpose in the 20 plus years that devolution has existed within the UK. But the flip side of the risk that you're setting out actually is that if neighbours of goodwill sit down and try to reach an agreement and cannot reach agreement, we're calling a common framework, that is simply a political decision that the downside of having a potential regulatory divergence or what have you is acceptable compared with what's regarded as the downside of the only compromise that was on offer. So that's a political judgment about what's acceptable. The other aspect of this bill, which has been massively controversial, is in relation to a breach of an existing international agreement that the UK has entered into. Given that context, surely we're now in a position where the Scottish government, the Welsh government, throughout the UK, can't really enter into common agreements with the common frameworks by agreement with the UK with a real confidence in thinking the UK will stick to its word. Surely this bill and the political ramifications of it actually make it harder to reach common frameworks by mutual agreement.
Well, I find it very difficult to disagree with that last part. I mean, that is one of the dangers of the UK's position. The UK government's position is that once you start expressly breaching provisions of an agreement you have entered into, you know, as in daily life, if you're seen as somebody who breaks your promises, people will stop believing your promises, and that's one of the reasons why it's often a good idea to keep your promises. No, I don't disagree with you about that. I mean, in relation to I think it's absolutely fair point to say that it, in the end, is a political judgment as to what degree of market disturbance of the internal market or risk of disturbance of the internal market you are prepared to accept. And if one looks at federal systems throughout the world, one can see the different degrees of acceptance of that. Yeah. I mean, at one end, perhaps you have the United States, which has very limited actually controls on what the states do in terms of their legislative powers too. And in fact, as anyone knows who's ever spent time in the United States or sort of dealt with issues in the United States, there's endless cross-state restrictions on the ability of entities based in one state to trade in another. And it's a real, in many ways, the US internal market is far less developed than the EU internal market, particularly in areas like mutual recognition of professional qualifications. If you want an architect license in California, you cannot set up business in Las Vegas because it's a different state. And none of that would exist within the EU. And that's a decision dating right back to 1789, the framers of the Constitution took. In Australia, you have a different approach with much wider constitutional principle that constrains state powers in these areas. There's the Swiss position, which Ken Armstrong set out in his paper that he wrote for you on the bill, and he sets out that chapter. It was a different approaches that were made, and you're absolutely right. Ultimately, that's a political judgment to make. But I think if you're going to say common frameworks alone with in a sense nothing as a backup, then you're making a political judgment that you're making about what happens if the common frameworks break down, and you're essentially saying we're prepared to take the risk that there may be significant, perhaps, disruption in the internal market. We're prepared to take that risk because the overall principle that the devolved governments must not be interfered with, except when they agree, is one that we want to fight to preserve. But that's a political judgment.
One other point that I wanted to put to Michael Keating, if there's time, convener, and it was about the comment in his written submission about the role of the CMA. And this was touched on very briefly in discussion with, I think, Murdo Fraser earlier, but not in very much detail. Now, the CMA, Competition Markets Authority, is effectively being appointed as the devolved government's advisor as well as the UK government's advisor. So its advisory role would be in relation to the devolved functions of the Scottish government, not just in relation to UK-wide matters. And Michael Keating's paper makes the point that there is no Scottish input to the appointment of the CMA's chair, board or panel. The bill, the act rather, is the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act that sets up the appointment powers, also places no requirement on the Secretary of State to ensure the chair, the board or the panel have, for example, individuals with a professional background in public health, professional background in environmental protection. It doesn't place those requirements about the composition of the board or the panel. So I wonder if Michael Keating would expand on these issues in relation to what may be the deficiencies of appointing the CMA as the advisor. And if the bill was passed as it currently stands, would the Scottish Government subsequently still have the power to appoint a different advisor? Given that its devolved functions are still devolved, would it retain the power to pass a separate piece of legislation to appoint a different advisor to carry out these functions in relation to devolved matters?
On your last point, I would think, yes, the Scottish Government can take advice wherever it likes, and it does engage counsel indeed to plead its cases in these instances, such as minimum pricing of alcohol. So it wouldn't be obliged simply to rely on the CMA. On the CMA itself, this is problematic now in various submissions, including one which the Royal Society of Edinburgh, with my participation, put into the Scottish Parliament. We talked about the need for some kind of arbitrator and some kind of impartial source of research and evidence, not just in relation to this, but in relation to intergovernmental disputes generally. But this would be a clear example of the need for such a case. Now, such a body exists in Spain. They have a Unity of the Market Act, which has been passed, quite controversial, but there is a council on the internal market in Spain which represents the central government and the autonomous communities, that is the devolved governments. They have a secretariat that does the research. They have a voting procedure in the council. Only at the last resort do things come to the courts. So before you get to the courts, there's an awful lot of negotiation there. That's the model that we might think of here. Certainly, given that the matters that are being debated here are not purely technical, but highly politically charged, it would seem reasonable that this body should have broader representation, or at least it should be appointed and owned by all the governments of the United Kingdom, and not just by the UK government itself. No matter what the goodwill, no matter how professional these people are, the lines of accountability have to be clear, and they have to be, the loyalty has to be to the United Kingdom, not to the UK government of the time, or to a particular conception of what the UK is all about. I think that would be a fairly easy thing to do and would be a very useful amendment and would set a precedent for other areas of intergovernmental relations where this capacity is lacking.
Thank you. I see George Peretz has added in the text box that he would like to make a comment if there's time, convener, on this point.
I'll go to George quickly, then I'm going to go to Angela, who's got a supplementary in this area.
Just very briefly on the CMA. I mean, CMA does already, in exercise of its competition jurisdiction, sometimes have to think about issues of environment and public health, because sometimes, you know, anti-competitive, what might be an anti-competitive agreement is justified on environmental or health grounds, and the CMA has to think about that. And it's done that so far fairly well, without necessarily having to have environmental or health competence. On the broader point, though, in fact, I suggested in evidence to the Brexit Select Committee about 18 months ago, when it was mooted that the CMA might have state aid responsibilities. I gave evidence to the effect it seemed to me sensible that if that was so, that the CMA should be appointed jointly by all the devolved administrations and the UK government. I remember that Joanna Cherry, who all of you will know, rather understandably picked me up on that particular bit of evidence, and in fact she suggested that the CMA might usefully be based in Edinburgh, a suggestion which I thought was perhaps not a bad one, although one might note that if Scotland became independent, you then might have to there'd be then an issue about moving it back to England, which might be slightly expensive. But it does seem to me that particularly if the CMA is ever going to be given state aid or anti-subsidy responsibilities, because that is very much an incursion into the activities of government. It certainly, and that possibility has not been ruled out. It may happen. it seems to me that if that happens, the case becomes unanswerable for the CMA to be, instead of as it were, a creature of Westminster, become a creature of all the four governments, and that would have the incidental advantage of increasing its independence from Westminster, which it would certainly need if it were given anti-subsidy responsibilities, although that at the moment is certainly not certain and not expressly mooted.
Yeah, but its remit is still framed as competition in markets rather than the wider public good. But thank you both for your comments.
Yes.
Thank you, Patrick. Now, I think earlier on we were touching on matters to do with trade, and that's when Angela put in her R. So, Angela, I think you've got a supplementary in that area.
I do, Convener. Thank you. Mr. Perez earlier spoke about the impact on reputational damage of a government or a country when they breach international law. And I suppose that's particularly true when you breach international law that you only passed some months ago. But I wondered if Mr. Perez could say more about what impact this would have on the ability to negotiate a trade deal if people find you less than trustworthy, and, you know, if and how this action by the UK government puts at risk sustainable and beneficial trading relationships with international partners, and actually whether ultimately it means that, you know, the UK at the end of the day is going to have to be less choosy about who it enters a trade agreement with and the terms of any such agreement.
Yes. Well, as always, for sort of questions of international law, there's a sort of both a political and a legal aspect to this. But I mean, the most obvious difficulty that the UK government's position causes is our negotiations with the EU, starting closest to home. I mean, the EU's position and the position of the EU Parliament has already been made clear, and it seems to me that if there is simply no way in which the EU is going to be prepared to conclude a free trade agreement with the UK while these provisions are going through Parliament, and I think it will insist that the government withdraw them. I mean, somewhat interestingly, you may or may not have picked up on this, Lord Keane, who's you know, is the Advocate General for Scotland and the government's chief legal advisor on Scots law, was saying yesterday in the House of Lords that his view, as far as he was concerned, the powers in the bill would only be used in circumstances where Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol applied. That's the safeguards provision, which in some situations allows unilateral action to be taken by the parties in response to serious economic or social disturbances. Or, he said, if there was a fundamental breach by the EU, a situation which is a matter of international law would entitle the UK to depart from its obligations under the treaty, you know, like a contract. If the other side breaches a treaty, your own obligations under the treaty are reduced, just as if somebody breaks a contract with you, your contractual obligations are reduced. So essentially what he was saying was that the bill would only be used in circumstances where international law actually permitted it, which rather raises the question of why you need to exclude relevant international law as a ground of a challenge for the regulations, and I suspect somebody's going to have a go at testing that. Yeah, so I mean, more to return to your question. I mean, obviously, as far as the EU is concerned, this is a deal breaker. As you're probably aware, there have been statements from the United States Congress, which would have to ratify any deal between the UK and the US, that it would not be prepared to do so if there was any threat to the Good Friday Agreement. So, I mean, and sort of more generally, as a matter of reputation. I mean, you could say that some trading partners may take the view that they don't really care about any of this. It's all about the UK's relationships with the EU, which are sort of very complicated. They may accept UK government. It's only because of the extraordinary circumstances of the UK withdrawal that the UK took this action, and of course, in general terms, it would be said the UK sticks by its international commitments. It's possible that some partners would accept that and not be particularly concerned. Other partners may be. But I think more broadly, the UK one example, it's a fairly obvious example, but the UK has been strongly condemnatory of China for its breaches of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And the Chinese law on Hong Kong has rightly been denounced by the Foreign Secretary as a breach of that agreement. Well, one does, I think, already see references in the Chinese press to, well, it's only a specific and limited breach of the Chinese obligations. Your words get thrown back at you.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Mr. Perrett.
Okay, I'm going to move on. George Adam, because time is getting a bit shorter. George.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, gentlemen. I'm desperately trying to, find a question that someone hasn't all asked at this stage, but also to find a way to relate this to people in my own constituency, what they're dealing with and how it would affect them. And one of the ones that came to mind was when I heard the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell, talk about Scottish Water potentially having issues or being possibly exposed to some of the problems within the UK Internal Market Bill. Now, we've already been advised that, the UK Internal Market Bill could expose the Scottish public sector to external market forces. Now, this is directed at George Perrett. Would that be the case? And could there be a threat to Scottish Water in its current guise?
I find it slightly hard to see how, because, water, of course, is not, water through pipes is not traded across borders, not because there's any legal impediment, but because, it just isn't. The water that Scotland consumes comes from the beautiful Scottish mountains. It doesn't, by and large, come from England. And we English unfortunately have to consume our own water rather than have access to yours. So I find it slightly difficult to see how the water would be impacted, but the fact that I don't see it doesn't mean that it isn't there, and I just like to see the argument.
What I was trying to say, George, was the fact that obviously Scottish Water being a publicly owned company, and the market in England, per se, being open, a free market effectively in water. Now, would there not be a case or an argument made by certain operators that in a UK internal market they would challenge the fact that they would accuse Scottish Water of having effectively having the market, the full market to themselves, and that they would have a right to actually be part of that. They need access to that market. Could that not be an argument they would make? And would that not threaten Scottish Water as in its current guise?
Yeah, to be frank, I haven't sort of thought about that issue, and said I'd need a bit of notice of that question. I'd have to look through the bill with that question in mind and see if I could work out a way in which that argument might get purchase. I think without having done that exercise, I can't say that it couldn't happen, but it isn't something that struck me on the face of the bill as something that could. But frankly, that's because I wasn't thinking about that issue as I was going through the bill, so I simply don't know. I'm afraid I don't think I can help you on that.
Could you possibly have a look at that, George, and get back to us?
I could have a look at that.
Yeah, because it's basically quite interesting.
It'd be helpful to see because always in sort of commenting on a legal concern, it would be helpful to see what the basis of the concern was. So if there's something that Mike Russell has put in the public domain, if somebody could send me a copy, that would obviously be quite helpful.
Yeah. The other thing that you mentioned, this is just my final question, is to George again, is basically, you mentioned that negotiations and frameworks in the internal market and how things would work. Now, is it not the case that if there is a change, or if we're talking about business again, trying to get access to certain markets and in the public sector, if you're talking about NHS in particular as well, would there not be a case where, how do you manage to negotiate that? You've already said this to a certain degree, but how, if you've got a framework, you've negotiated that framework, you've tried to negotiate it to make sure you're protecting public sector, just say NHS for talking's sake, but then you've got the fact that the UK ministers can actually just decide and push through what they want through the UK Internal Market Bill, or Act as it would be then. So, what's the motivation for any of the devolved nations to try and actually work constructively within the process to try and do it, because basically you've got the UK ministers coming at you 100 mile an hour on a juggernaut, and you've got to get out of it quite quickly or do it their way.
Yeah, well, I think that's the point I made earlier, is that the parties' positions in any negotiation are, strength of the parties' position in any negotiations are very much determined by what happens if the negotiation breaks down. And if the answer to that question as a result of the internal market bill is the UK government can essentially do what it wants, that greatly strengthens their hand in the negotiations. Now, I'm sure that the constraints are political at that point. I mean, politically, the UK government will probably, one assumes, not want too obviously to be high-handed. I say that perhaps rather more hopefully than with expectation, and it's a political comment. But I mean, there will be some political constraints on its on the extent to which it seemed to be throwing its weight around. But if legally, it's in a very strong position to respond to the failure of a framework negotiation to turn into an agreed consensus by simply doing what it wanted to do in the first place, it is in a strong position. I think there's any way around that. And the extent to which one relies on the political constraints is a exercise in political judgment. And I suspect you have your views on that.
Okay, George, is that you complete?
That's me,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, can I thank our witnesses warmly this morning for the evidence they provided. We've certainly covered a lot of ground, and we've given you some things to go away and do some more homework on, so we're very grateful for that. I now will suspend this meeting for about 5 minutes to around 11:07 to ensure that our next panel of witnesses is ready. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you very much. We now continue to take evidence on the UK Internal Market Bill in our next evidence session. I welcome to the meeting Jonathan Hall, who's the Director of Policy at NFU Scotland, Professor David Bell from the University of Stirling, and David Thompson, who's the Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation in Scotland. I remind members that they should direct their questions to a named witness, and if any of the witnesses wishes to respond, then please can you request to speak using the chat function. Can I begin? As you know, Clause 46 would create a new power for ministers to provide money directly to anyone, including organisations working in devolved areas. Now, Professor David Bell, you say in your paper that the bill gives wide powers to the UK government over who it might receive funding, and specifically the power to provide financial assistance to any person. You go on to say, for instance, that direct funding to local government may provide greater recognition for the role of the UK government in funding projects, but it's difficult to see that the lack of consultation and cooperation between different levels of government will lead to an efficient use of public money. Can you expand on your views and what this might mean for the principle of taking decisions as close to the people as affected as possible? And you may have heard some of the evidence in the previous session around the effect, potential effect, unintentionally perhaps, on the Barnett formula process. David, can I ask you to pick up on that first, please? David, are you hearing us? Okay, I don't think David can hear me. In which case, at this stage, would any other members be prepared to pick up on that? If not, I'll go to my second question area and come back to David. Okay, so listen, in that case, I'm going to go to my second question area. Previously, the National Farmers Union of Scotland said on the Internal Market White Paper that mutual recognition and non-discrimination proposals would in effect drive coaching horses through the concept of commonly agreed frameworks. This is because something that could be produced with significantly different environmental standards in one part of the UK would have to be accepted as a legitimate product to be sold or used in another part of the UK. Can I firstly ask Johnny Hall, now that you've seen the bill, is this still the NFU's position? And if so, are there any amendments to the bill which you believe protect the concept of commonly agreed frameworks? Johnny, perhaps you can pick up on that first, please.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I think in general terms, that is still our position. We still have some significant outstanding concerns that whilst the intention of the non-discrimination and, mutual recognition and non-discrimination proposals within the bill are designed to facilitate the free flow of goods and services throughout the UK internal market. Nevertheless, it seems to be the bill's the way the bill is currently set up, that it would basically sidestep the issue of commonly agreed frameworks. We do not view, as I think you already are aware, we do not view the non-discrimination mutual recognition elements as being a direct alternative to common frameworks. We don't believe it's a binary choice between the two. We believe that you could have a backstop, if that's an appropriate expression, of the proposals in the bill, but to protect the devolution settlement, and in order to therefore have a degree of divergence where appropriate at regulatory level, but still enable the free flow of goods and services, then the better approach would be to establish proper common frameworks with governance and dispute resolution elements written into that. Now, obviously, the bill sets up the Office of the Internal Market, but that seems to be from the bill very much just a data collection and reporting exercise with insufficient teeth to then govern issues around disputes and so on. The bill as currently drafted, obviously it's only just gone through report stage, it is lacking in terms of providing a more constructive approach which would respect the devolution settlements.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know, David, obviously, given Food and Drink Federation perspective on these areas, do you want to contribute on that question as well? David, on you go.
Thank you, Convener. So what I wanted to say, I think, was that having listened to the earlier evidence session, it's quite clear that the view of those witnesses was that the internal market bill would specifically provide an undermining of any frameworks that were agreed. So therefore, I can understand that point of view. I suppose the question that we have for the bill and for the frameworks is really where are the frameworks? We haven't seen or been consulted on the frameworks themselves, so it's quite difficult, I think, to comment on whether there will be an impact on the best way to work. We are, from a business perspective, having a clear set of regulations across the UK, and those regulations being as converged as possible makes it easier to do business. So that's a positive. But if the frameworks, were to be published and they were to provide a clear way for that to happen, then obviously that would be helpful. But as of now, we haven't seen any of the frameworks or been consulted on them.
Thank you, David. David, can I also ask you, the Scottish Food and Drink Federation recommended in your submission to the committee's initial inquiry on the UK internal market that the Food and Drink Federation, that the devolved nations should work together with the UK government to create an arbiter of the UK internal market, and this could include Scottish, English, Irish and Welsh judges, or an internal market commissioner. Does that remain your view, and to what extent does the bill address your concerns in that regard, and do you think there's still some way to go?
So firstly, it does remain our view. That's what we submitted to the white paper on the internal market as well. The bill goes some way to doing that. So it establishes a mechanism in order to regulate, or to comment on regulation at least. However, it doesn't, as has been pointed out in the previous session, it doesn't seem to have created that set of interactions and relationships with the devolved administrations, and that's something that we called for also in our white paper on the internal market. So for us, it's been very clear that there's some steps there, but in order for it to be equitable and to work in a way that all administrations will be more likely to respect, it should have inbred into it a better set of relationships with the devolved administrations, not just the UK Parliament.
Johnny, do you want to reflect on any of that?
Other than to just concur with David, we have been relatively unsighted on the development of common frameworks by both the UK and the Scottish governments over the piece. And I guess it's a frustration on many stakeholders' parts that we have talked about common frameworks and their governance and their role in dispute resolution, et cetera, for at least 2 years now, if not 3, and yet we still find ourselves here at the 11th hour being sort of almost the gun to the head situation of looking at a UK internal market bill, when in fact, if we put the time and effort into developing common frameworks properly in the first place, then the need for some elements of the UK internal market bill would not necessarily be the same. So that is a frustration I think many stakeholders have shared.
I'm going to go to Tom Arthur, who has a supplementary in this area, I think, because he's put an R in, and I'm hoping that David Bell will then be in the room to be able to discuss the areas we wanted to talk to him about. But Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning. It's really just a brief supplementary for Mr Hall. Can I ask him to clarify what he means by the UK Internal Market Bill as a backstop, to use his words?
Well, the concept of mutual recognition and non-discrimination is essentially the basis of all internal markets that already exist, including the EU single market, which we are still effectively part of, and is also the basis of nearly all free trade agreements, that you have some form of mutual recognition and some form of non-discrimination. Otherwise, those trade agreements and those internal markets would not work. And I think that was hinted at quite heavily in the previous session. So it provides, like, if you like, that, you know, backstop's maybe not the right expression, especially in the context of a Northern Irish protocol. But so it provides that baseline, if you like. But nevertheless, it is not, it shouldn't be the only way in which we operate on an internal market basis, because if we're going to respect differentials across an internal market with different nations involved and different devolved administrations, and therefore different needs in terms of differentiated approaches, then you need something to operate over and above that, and that's where the common frameworks have to come in. So it's only an insurance. It's simply an insurance policy, nothing else. But it shouldn't be the first and foremost approach. It should be an insurance policy.
Thank you. When giving evidence to the committee a couple of weeks ago, this is really just to sort of clarify, to make sure I understand your position. I put the question to you, Mr Hall, to make sure that I have understood your position. I will summarise. We should agree through negotiation, and we should never have to use any backstop measures. Ultimately, it should be a relationship of equality and parity, with no administration being able to cast a veto, but equally no administration being able to impose on another. You responded to that, Mr Hall. Absolutely. Everything that we have said, that commonly agreed frameworks, is couched in terms of no one administration imposing on the others and none being able to veto. That will coerce the point at which a common agreement is reached, because ultimately no single party has a final say over the others. And I'm quoting from the official report.
Sorry, you've broken up slightly there. Can everyone hear me still?
Tom, try again that final sentence.
That final sentence I just said there, I just wanted to clarify that what I quoted to you from the official report is still your position, that there should be absolutely no need to use any backstop measures, and it should be a relationship of parity and equality.
Absolutely it should, and that's why common frameworks are our proposed and much preferred approach. But in order to ensure that there is continuity in an internal market within the UK, then I guess it's that insurance policy that you hope you won't have to use, that we will need some sort of non-discrimination and mutual recognition approach to be in place. Now, I'm not saying as it's written it's the right way to do it, because it seems to be very much, dare I say, heavy-handed approach that's been set out in both the white paper and the bill. But in an ideal internal market situation, or in any free trade agreement, you are looking at equal, what's the right expression, equal interests being protected and maintained in terms of who has say over what. And in this way, the bill's proposals would appear to ride roughshod over that and sideline the whole issue around common frameworks.
Okay, I'm going to go back now to David. David, I asked a couple other questions while you were gone, just to make sure we could get you back into the room to start at the beginning as far as the question I wanted to ask you is concerned. I understand you're there now.
I think so.
Good. As you know, David, Clause 46 would create a new power for ministers to provide money directly to anyone, including organisations working in devolved areas. And you said in your paper that the bill provides wide powers to the UK government over who might receive funding, specifically the power to provide financial assistance to any person. Can I ask you, therefore, to expand on your views what this might mean for the principle of taking decisions as close to the people affected as possible? And you may have heard some of the other evidence earlier around the Barnett formula and whether or not you would like to reflect on what you heard earlier as well. So over to you, David. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. And I'm assuming everyone can hear me now. I'm sorry about the delay. So the powers proposed in the bill are extremely wide in relation to financial support. The UK government is now taking power to spend effectively across a wide range of different topics and deliver that money to any person. That's the phrase that's specifically used within the bill. And of course, this has been kind of parachuted into the debate without any previous discussion or negotiation. What does it do? Well, I did hear the earlier debate, and Michael made the point that it perhaps forms a possibility for a way of getting around the Barnett formula so that monies could be directed not through block grants to the Scottish Government, but direct to individuals, companies, local authorities, a wide range of possible actors. There is an interesting point which I think is actually possible. I have asked about this as to whether NDPBs, which are the children effectively of the Scottish Government, could receive funding in this way. And I think that may still be possible. I'm thinking of bodies like this Skills Development Scotland, which have received large amounts of European funding in the past. So there are possibilities for bypassing effectively the Scottish Government. As Michael said, the Barnett formula is not written in law. This may be a way of trying to erode its longevity, which is perhaps quite amazing, given that it started in 1979 as a sort of interim measure. But the question of bypassing the Scottish block grant, partly it depends on how big the amounts of money that might be doing this bypassing amount to. So there's Bayes published a press release or a note alongside the UK Internal Market Bill, which sort of alluded to the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the fund that is intended to replace the European structural funds. Now, for Scotland, this isn't a huge amount of money. It came through the Scottish Government. It sort of what the Scottish Government acted as the EU's agent in Scotland for those monies. But it isn't a huge amount of money. So if that was what was being thought of, then the overall effect on Barnett probably wouldn't be all that large. But the list of areas where the UK government is apparently taking some view that it might spend in these areas is pretty wide. I mean, it starts with economic development, but it then goes on to infrastructure, talks about culture and sport, and certainly the last two have been thought to be the preserve of the Scottish Government in the past. If it's badging relatively small amounts of money, as Michael said, so just in the way that the EU did in the past, then maybe that's not too threatening. but the bill as written doesn't make any of this clear.
Okay, Murdo, you've got a supplementary here, and at the same time you might want to go on to ask your main question if it's not in this area.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. I had a question for David Bell, which fits in as a supplementary to your question, and then I've got a separate question for the other two witnesses. But just on this point, David, about the spending powers for the UK government, is it not really just a replacement for EU structure funds that we're talking about here, where already the EU structure funds spend across quite a broad range of areas? And indeed, there's another current model you'll be aware of, which is the issue of city deals that are partly funded by UK government and partly funded by Scottish government. And to give a local example you'll be familiar with, the Tay Cities deal provides that the UK government are contributing, I think it's £10 million to the development of the Perth City Hall project, which is a cultural project, but being funded by the UK government. So I'm wondering whether what we're looking at here really is just a development of what's already happening.
So thank you, Murdo. I mean, that's possible. That is possible, and certainly the note from Bayes, it was only the European structural funds and the Shared Prosperity Fund as a replacement for these that was mentioned in that, but it's not clear in the way that the bill is worded that is the extent of the ambition here. I don't think any of us are in a position to know what extent that might be the case. I guess one thing, certainly the city deals increase the profile of the UK government across the whole of the UK. The many deals that have been done. I think it is worth asking the question whether these are necessarily the best way to operate public policy. I guess that will come out perhaps in the evaluation, but the possibility of different levels of government trying to do different things without having some common agreement about the way forward does seem to me to be a potential danger from this, and I suppose then the onus is on both parties to try to figure out what is the best approach in terms of delivering objectives. Now, one of the points that I made in the paper is that there are potentially differing objectives that the Scottish Government has from what the UK government has. I guess the resolution has to be through some form of negotiation. But again, in all of this, and Michael mentioned this in his last talk, that there is the issue of subsidiarity. And effectively, I've been looking at ways of replacing the European funding in Scotland, and part of the debate that we've been having is whether at what level of government decisions should be made about funding. And some of them actually, we've had some very interesting debates about community empowerment, about getting communities involved in designing projects and so on. And this is a very complex issue, and it seems to me that we need some kind of overall framework that is negotiated between the different levels of government, whether that be between the UK and Scotland, or Scotland and the local authorities, or the regional enterprise partnerships, whatever that might be. There has to be some shared understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve with the kinds of interventions that like the Tay City deal, for example.
Okay, thank you. I mean, there's a lot we could explore there, not least more powers to local government, which is probably slightly out with the scope of this discussion. But
sure.
I'm sure we can come back to this a future point. I wonder if I can move on and ask a separate question to David Thompson and to Johnny Hall. And again, it just goes back to a little bit to the earlier discussion. And I suppose maybe to start with you, David Thompson. What in your view is the advantage of this bill? What is the value of the UK market to your member companies, and why does the operation of the internal market, the smooth operation of the internal market, matter to your members?
Thank you. Well, we represent both, native Scottish companies headquartered here, and others who manufacture here. And obviously, the operation of the internal market as it currently exists through the EU rules is one that allows, a turnover of around about £16 billion worth of food and drink manufacturing in Scotland. So it's critical. And if you think about it in those kind of terms, then while we export about £6 billion of that, 80% of the rest of it, so about £8 billion, is the worth to Scottish companies of the rest of the UK market. So it's a significantly important industry. So the smooth operating of the UK market and minimal regulatory differences are of key importance to us. What the bill, I think, is seeking to address is the common framework that we had within the European Union, rules set by the European Parliament and put in place by the Commission. And all of those provided an underpinning so that any regulation in any part of the UK would always be part of that framework. Now, when we come out of Europe, we don't have that framework. And so the potential is that there would be much greater differentiation between the regulations in each different part of the UK. And that's the bit that causes our members concern, because what they would like to see is the minimal regulatory divergence, because that makes it less costly for them and easier for them to both produce and to sell food across the UK. So for us, that's the importance of some sort of understanding of what the UK internal market would be like.
Okay, David, thank you very much. And maybe I could ask the same question to Johnny Hall, please.
Yes. Morning. Morning, Murdo. In terms of agricultural exports to the rest of the UK, rather than food and drink per se, where the Scottish Government figures are that it's worth about £855 million to the Scottish agricultural industry, of a total exports out of Scotland of about 1.5 billion. So you're looking at about 60% of all the agricultural products that leave Scotland are destined for other parts of the United Kingdom. So the internal market in that sense is extremely important, more important than the EU and the rest of the world put together in agricultural terms, not necessarily in terms of food and drink value. But I'd also go a stage further, and I'd also say that the internal market is also very, very important for the inputs to agricultural businesses as well. It's not just about what we produce and what we sell. Scotland relies on the rest of the United Kingdom for inputs to agriculture, because at the end of the day, an agricultural business uses a lot of inputs to produce an output, not only from the rest of the UK, but obviously from Europe and other parts of the world as well. And I also would equally echo and concur with David's comments around the need to operate on an even footing, if you like, in terms of regulatory arrangements, in order to avoid any cost disparity between production of food, certainly agricultural production in Scotland, as opposed to other parts of the United Kingdom. And that is the fundamental reason why we've always maintained that we need regulatory convergence in the UK on all the things that govern agricultural interests, in order to make sure that there is effectively we play the same set of rules, so that there is not a distortion in terms of competition, and that's the fundamental premise on our argument here.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, okay. Then I was going to ask a supplementary, but I just thought better of it, Murdo. I'll ask George Adam to come in that case. I might come back later.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. We heard from George Peretz earlier on that the UK government would have the final say in any negotiations, any disagreements between the devolved nations. They'd have the final. This is a question for Professor David Bell. You know, they would have the final say in everything. Now, surely in this time when we're talking about trying to find things, localise everything, surely that doesn't make for constructive and intergovernmental dialogue. And mid to long term, does this not cause a problem with the relationship between the devolved nations and central government? And also, does it not make things feel as if the devolved nations are powerless?
So I think I'll echo what Michael Keating said, that we're actually not really sure in the UK whether we're a single state, a single unitary state, or somewhere close to a federation of nations. And because of that unease and the sovereignty of the UK Parliament, it's not clear that in any negotiation that the devolved, under the current set of circumstances, that the devolved nations have much in the way of bargaining power. Now, of course, that doesn't make for good relations. If you think that in any card game that you play with them, the other side has always got a winning hand. So it seems to me that it does place the devolved nations in a difficult situation, and at the moment I can't see there's any easy path out to a way where in any negotiation, given the constitutional framework at the moment, that the devolved powers are going to go into negotiations with a stronger hand.
Okay. There was also discussion in the previous panel, and as again for Professor Bell, with regards to the threat to the public sector in Scotland through the UK Internal Market Bill. Now, I brought up the potential with Scottish Water, the idea that I was trying to relate it to my constituents, something that would affect them in a day-to-day life, and the fact that there could be a threat to the public sector in so much as Scottish Water being a public company, and there's a chance that companies from down south who have a different market would say they're not getting access to that market through the UK internal market. Do you believe that could be a threat for us in Scotland? And if it is there any way we could combat
it? I'm not hearing David, folks. Can I just check that everyone else can hear David?
No.
No, David, hold on. We're not hearing you. Broadcasting, can you confirm what's happening? I'm still not hearing David. Sorry, George, I might come back to you. Yeah. Just to keep continuity going here. I think I need to move on to, unless you've got another question of the other two witnesses, George.
No, I'm fine. We'll just move on at this stage.
In which case, I'm going to go to Patrick Harvey, and hopefully we can connect back up with David again. Patrick.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the witnesses. I suppose I was a little bit amused at Murdo Fraser's question, asking in the one breath what the value of this bill was and what the value of the UK's internal market was, as though these are the same things. Jonathan Hall earlier gave a fairly clear indication that there's a preference for the common frameworks approach, the approach of reaching agreement by negotiation, while still saying that there might be, in the absence of common frameworks, some need for a kind of fallback position, if you like. What would you say? I'll come to Mr. Hall first, and then to the other panelists if they want. What would you say to the view that this bill, by not only saying we will retain the power at the end of the day, so that negotiation means agree to what we want or we'll do it anyway, but also the political ramifications of a bill which explicitly gives the power to break an international treaty, undermines the trust that any negotiating partner, including the devolved governments, have in the UK government's word. Doesn't this bill and its political context make it harder to achieve common frameworks, any kind of negotiated outcome, and therefore put at risk the cooperation that a mutually agreeable internal market relies upon? And I'm not hearing Mr. Hall either. Oh, there you are. Yeah,
I was on mute for a second, but I think you can hear me now. I would tend to concur with you, Patrick. I tend to view this as something that clearly this has all come about because as the situation is now, currently we have EU regulation which is applied at UK level but has a certain amount of differentiation where possible under the devolved administrations. But what we're facing here is something that will replace the EU governance of regulation and trade with a rather blunter instrument. And I suspect that the logic behind the UK government in its thinking is that international trade and trade deals are a reserve matter, and therefore the UK government's thinking must be along the lines that in order to preserve the integrity of international trade agreements, that it wants to be able to be seen to be operating at a UK basis in a uniform way, so you don't have any differentiation which might undermine the trade deal. And yet some sensitive areas like food standards, etc., are devolved to a degree. And therefore, I think it's that premise on which the UK government has built this bill, in the sense that it's looking at its potential to negotiate international trading agreements, and therefore it's wanting to convey the impression that the UK internal market will be smooth and uniform and complete. But in terms of the political issues around the potential for undermining international treaties, particularly with reference to the Northern Irish Protocol, there is obviously a significant concern shared by all of us, certainly by NFU Scotland, that any government can at its choice or its preference renege, if that's the right expression, on those commitments. And therefore, going back to your first point, Patrick, is that our absolutely preference approach to this would be to have commonly agreed frameworks whereby each and every administration of the UK has a say and an input into how they operate, and that where you do have disputes, there is a process of dispute resolution to iron those things out. Now, in some ways, that's how the EU institutions currently operate. But that doesn't seem to be replicated in what we're bringing forward in terms of the UK internal market through this bill.
Yeah, I was going to come on to dispute resolution in a moment, but just in relation to the operation of policy making, the other difference with the EU, of course, is that the UK doesn't have anything comparable to a Council of Ministers in terms of co-decision making between member states. There is a UK government and there's a UK Parliament, but there's nothing that brings together the different governments within the UK to make decisions jointly, except this argument for common frameworks. You also said that in the absence of common frameworks, there's still a case for single UK-wide approach on many issues, is there a danger that some of your members might come to regret that position if, for example, a non-negotiated but imposed single position is adopted, not in relation to their production standard, but in relation to the standards of acceptable imports on sale, potentially undercutting your members' production? So is there a danger that single imposed standards might come to be harmful to your members and to other parts of the Scottish economy?
Yes, and the key word you use there is imposed, because that's taking away the ability for devolved administrations, particularly in the context of Scotland, to actually say, to seek a variance around something, or at least to come to an agreement about what should be the standard that is applied. And now, as soon as you have mutual recognition, particularly non-discrimination involved, then regardless of what Scotland's view of the world might be or what the standard should be set is, then once that's in place, that then becomes an imposition, because there would be no legal way to prevent something that's been produced at a different standard, either coming into the UK and then being sold or distributed across the UK, or indeed being produced in one part of the UK and then being sold or distributed in another part of the UK. So it's that word imposed, I think, is the critical one here. And that's the whole point of common frameworks, commonly and mutually agreed, that you do not have that imposed nature of this process. You get to it by consensus rather than by consultation. And I think that's the key that's missing at the moment, and that's what we've argued for.
Thank you. And on the point about resolving potential disputes, David Thompson earlier made there was some discussion about a proposal to have panels of judges from the different jurisdictions within the UK take on some of these issues, and that would be obviously in some ways a stronger mechanism than just having the Competition and Markets Authority advising the governments about regulations that they might consider making. Notwithstanding the concerns that I expressed in the last session about the CMA and its lack of either devolved representation or specific sectoral representation like environmental protection or public health expertise, wouldn't the danger of giving these decisions around dispute resolution to a panel of judges take it away from the democratic accountability that is necessary? Because the balance between the pros and cons of a market differentiation compared with the public health benefit, the environmental benefit, or any other public policy, those should be democratically accountable decisions. They're political and policy choices that parliaments and governments should be making. Wouldn't there be a danger that they become unaccountable if they're resolved purely by panels of lawyers?
Is that for me, Patrick?
Well, I had intended that for Mr. Thompson because it came up there, but if either of the witnesses want to comment on it, welcome.
I'm quite happy for David to lead on it.
Okay. Mr. Thompson?
Yes. Yes, and thank you for the question. I'm happy to say that yes, I mean that is a particular disbenefit of that proposal that was in our first submission. What we would say about dispute resolution is that firstly it needs some relationship with the legal systems and the laws of the four administrations. So in our response to the white paper, we've said that should be part of what's there. So as I said to the convener's question, the current assignment to the Competition and Market Authority and the way that it's put out does not seem to have that relationship with the four administrations. Now, whether that's a judge, whether that's somebody who's better equipped to represent a wider range of views, I think we would remain agnostic on. I think the second point around dispute resolution and the role of the Competition Market Authority is around the specialisms. Now, You've suggested a few. We would also suggest that, given the kind of technical and specialist nature of much food legislation, which will be covered by this, which includes things like contaminant legislation, food composition, production methods, etc., we would and did argue in our white paper response that there is a strong need for an understanding of those kinds of issues in whatever analysis and dispute resolution is set in place, because these are very technical, very complicated issues which may or may not have market effects depending on how they're applied and in what country they're applied in the UK. So that was one of the things that we were keen to get across to make sure that you had that kind of specialist understanding.
And so whether the focus is on the interests of market competitors, food and drink businesses that you represent, or your focus is on the public good in terms of an issue like public health or regulation, you would agree that the bill is effectively silent on this question, and that's deeply problematic.
Yes, and yes, probably.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Colleagues, just for information purposes for the panel and for my colleagues and members of the committee, we now have Professor Bell back online again. George, if I have time, I'll come back at the end to allow you to ask your question. But in the meantime, Alec Rowley had a supplementary in this area, I think.
Thanks, Convener. I think Patrick touched on it, but I would want to go into it again in terms of the Food and Drink Federation and NFU Scotland. I don't know if you heard George Perez earlier, where he gave the example of doing a trade deal with a country that allowed testing on animals. And I just worry for the future that this bill lays the ground for the view that the UK government could do a trade deal, USA for example, and we would see a massive decline in standards around food. We would see animals being imported into this country, so we would have cheap meat, but the animal rights and the way that animals are looked after. I mean, does this not bring a real threat, or could it bring a real threat to farming, to food and drink production across this country if there is a race to the bottom?
If you want me to cover that, and if I'm still on the mic, then I'll start with that, and then is that okay? So yes, I mean we're very clear that we, the food industry needs to retain high standards. It needs to do that from a UK perspective, actually, across the whole of the UK, and in particular from a Scottish perspective, where, as you know, we trade very highly on the quality of our produce. So from that point of view, then, anything, as Johnny said earlier, that was imposed on the industry without proper consultation and discussion and understanding of the different food industries, and they do exist in different parts of the UK, would be problematic. Now, this bill may or may not do that, but I think and certainly it seems to allow for the case that anything that can be allowed to be imported into one part of the UK, in this case it would be England, because they're responsible, the UK are responsible for making international trade deals, would then be allowed for sale in other parts of the UK. So that does, I would agree, put that in legislation. But I think the key thing is here the relationship that the government has, an understanding that the government has, whether that's the UK government or any of the devolved administrations, of the needs and aspirations of the food and drink industry in our case in these trade deals. And we would argue that they should be seeking to be defensive, absolutely, of such an important industry, both in Scotland and in the UK.
Johnny, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'll just come in and sort of back what David just said there. That, one outstanding concern that we have in all of this, and I'm sure it's shared by many others, and we need to have reassurance around this, is that the use of the mutual recognition and non-discrimination principles in areas where there are no common frameworks agreed or implemented, and we know that to be the case, then we can't allow those to operate in such a way that it does allow a race to the bottom by opening up the doorway to food that is produced at a different standard, whether it's animal health and welfare, whether it's environmental, or whatever it might be, being introduced into the UK market, but then being allowed to move within the EU market across all the devolved administrations at that level. And I think that is definitely a risk to Scottish agriculture and equally the integrity of Scotland's food and drink industry, which is built on very high standards and provenance. And it's something that we need to safeguard very, very carefully indeed.
Thanks, Bruce.
Okay, Angela Constance, please.
Convener, we've already touched upon how the internal market needs to deal with the implications of external trade. And in earlier discussion, the panel maybe heard about the reputational impact on economic and trading relationships when a state breaches international law. But given that we also have a public health pandemic, a global recession, an EU transition deadline of the 31st of December, certainty around a no deal or a low deal with the EU, I wondered if the panel had any concerns and whether or not there was anything in this bill that alleviated or increased those concerns. If I could start with the Professor of Economics, please.
So that's a wide-ranging question. There's certainly a lot to be worried about at the moment. The course of the pandemic is not good for economic activity right across the world. Obviously, and primarily, it's not good for public health. The UK leaving the EU is also going to be problematic for the economy. And there is an issue about, the UK negotiating trade deals with countries that are less important in trade terms than our EU neighbours. That does seem to be an issue. And I think in terms of trade deals, it's always worth remembering that countries go into trade deals with an expectation that they'll somehow benefit from them. And one of the ways that the US in particular goes into trade deals is to expect that its agriculture sector, which is huge and efficient, will make gains out of any trade arrangement that's reached, unless a country sees that there are benefits from a deal. It doesn't matter that much. The recently agreed deal with Japan, I think, is supposedly going to be good for Stilton cheese, but the overall effect on the economy is going to be relatively small. I guess, coming back to your question, the issue of whether this bill is particularly or helps quell the various worries that we have at the moment, that's not clear to me. I'm not sure that there was a rush to have this in place before we actually leave the EU, given that some progress at least is being made on common frameworks. And in a sense, as I mentioned in an earlier question, it's not entirely clear what it's for in terms of the financial provisions. Are we talking about the Shared Prosperity Fund or not? And there's nothing as yet that seems to me to be terribly clear about it. So I'm not sure. It certainly created a lot of problems for the UK government. I'm not clear that the provisions as far as they affect Scotland where it was necessary to introduce these at this stage.
Thank you. Does Mr Thompson have anything to add from a food and drink perspective?
Yes, and thank you. It's a very wide-ranging question. Obviously, we're concerned, in particular, to pick up on the progress of the free trade agreement with the European Union. So those negotiations. So they are exceptionally important to the food and drink industry. In Scotland, we would say around 70% of everything that is exported goes to the European Union. So the progress of that deal and the need to conclude something that is better than a no deal is really important. The likelihood of that seems quite low at the moment with the impact of the clauses in this bill and the fact that the time is getting very close to the 1st of January deadline. So those for us are critical issues at the moment. This bill, as I think as others have indicated, other than the Northern Ireland protocol changes to the withdrawal agreement, which does have a direct impact as we've discussed, but this bill doesn't seem to answer any of the direct worries that we have at the moment. So it doesn't answer our anything to do with the EU free trade agreement as far as we can see, except perhaps for ensuring that the UK government can impose whatever that agreement is across the rest of the UK. It doesn't help with any of the other free trade agreements like Japan or otherwise, except in the same way. If you had asked me before the white paper came about this, if my members were concerned about the functioning of the internal market going forward, the answer would have been a resounding no. So for us, while we do see the need to find a way to make it clear to businesses how this is going to operate going forward, the rush to get it done and the precise nature of the bill, we don't really understand the rush to get it done, and we're agnostic about the precise nature of the bill. It doesn't seem to answer any of the questions that we're most worried about at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And Mr Hall, I'm sure you'll have something to say.
Yes, I mean, clearly, as the two Davids have already commented upon, we're entering a period of incredible uncertainty, and particularly from an agricultural point of view, from individual farm and crop perspectives, if I can go down to that level. There's a whole sort of storm of unknowns approaching as we end transition. We go into 2021. We are effectively leaving the umbrella of the Common Agricultural Policy, as well as entering unknown trading environment. And whilst the aspiration for both Scottish Government and ourselves would be that we'd like to see an agricultural industry far more focused on the market and deriving more of its income from the marketplace, et cetera, and delivering on an environmental agenda as well. I suspect that in the short to medium term, the turbulence that many farm businesses will face will mean that there will be a significant increase in the reliance on direct support payments. But that's all in the context of what will be an incredibly difficult public spending arena, given that public finances at a UK and a Scottish Government level are going to be extremely stretched, not least because of the fallout and therefore the inevitable recovery from the COVID crisis that we've all endured. And I think there's some still incredible unknowns out there about how supply chains will align, and all sorts of other things, which means that individual businesses are operating, well, certainty is never abundant, but operating with less certainty than before. And I think there will be some harsh decisions around what businesses do and do not do in the near future. And we could see a significant restructuring of Scottish agriculture because of a whole sort of mix of different influences.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Angela. Alexander Burnett, please.
Thank you, Convener. My question on the bill is how it interacts with the common frameworks. And if I could start by directing my question to Jonathan. Both NFUS and the Federation Food and Drink Scotland have been very clear in their submissions of the benefits of the UK internal market continuing to operate as it does now, and I believe we're all in favour of the introduction of common frameworks. However, the NFUS suggests that the insurance policy or the sweeping up powers of the internal market legislation should come after the development and implementation of common frameworks. But given, say, only 6 of these common frameworks might be completed by the end of a transition period, and given there's no extension to this period, where we're under EU law, which currently preserves our internal market, can I ask, what is the risk to our internal market if a bill is not in place by the 1st of January?
Well, I'd like to think that the risk wouldn't be altogether great, because at the end of the day, the withdrawal agreement essentially rolls over all existing EU regulation into UK and Scots law, and we will continue to operate as we do now under existing directives and existing policy. But I suspect that as things develop over time and changes are started to be made in terms of how we start to diverge from Europe in whatever way, shape and form, that those cracks will start to appear. So I don't believe it will be an overnight issue, because I still think that the internal UK market will operate as it pretty much does now, because essentially all that legislation governing the EU single market will transfer to governing the UK single market, if I can put it in those terms. That's not the immediate concern, but the then becomes the concern as to how and when trade agreements are put in place, not only with the US and Japan, etc., but obviously the trading arrangement and the relationship with the EU, which will come about pretty quickly. How will that then shape and influence how things are done within the UK? And I guess that's the concern. I referenced it earlier on in a comment to another question, in the sense that we've had long enough to have put together and put in place a process by which we can get to commonly agreed, mutually agreed frameworks. We've been talking about them for 2 to 3 years minimum, and yet out of the blue, well, not out of the blue entirely, but certainly coming up at the 11th hour, we have a 4-week consultation on a white paper in July, and we've now got a bill introduced to the UK Parliament in the first week of September, and it's now on a fast-track course to be put in place by the end of the year. So I still think that we need to put as much effort and as we possibly can into getting to the point where we get to common frameworks which are governed properly and adequately and have all the right processes in place. And therefore, essentially, we divert the need to implement some of the elements that are in the bill.
And so do you think the bill then might provide the necessary motivation to progress common frameworks?
Well, I certainly think that the dialogue and the discussion around common frameworks has increased in recent weeks, because the bill was, or certainly the white paper back in July and the beginning of August was put in front of us all, and I think that then refocused certainly a lot of thinking, a lot of discussion around common frameworks. But at the end of the day, as stakeholders, we have little or no involvement in that, other than a degree of consultation. It's down to the UK government working with the devolved administrations to bring those common frameworks about. And we have seen a degree of movement in some areas, but we're still significantly lacking in others.
Thank you. And Professor Bell, do you want to add anything to that?
Not really. I mean, I agree with Jonathan. I mean, it is very disappointing the rate of progress towards establishing the common frameworks, and I agree with both of them that I don't have serious concerns that post 31st December the UK market will somehow have a seizure. I don't think it will. It will carry on, and it's only as policy differences emerge, and probably both Edinburgh and London are too concerned with other issues at the moment to be thinking about areas where such divergence may be occurring, I think it will take a little bit of time before there's a need to really focus on this.
Thank you. And David Thompson.
Yes, as I said earlier, I don't think there's an immediate need. I don't think the market will collapse on the 1st of January. I would be slightly more prosaic, though, because there are, and we raised this in our submission to the white paper, there are numerous areas which interact with this or could potentially interact with this, not necessarily immediately, not over the next 6 months, but which will be impacted. So the example that we've used is the deposit return system in Scotland. It was enacted this year. Well, it was enacted 2 or 3 years ago, but with the secondary legislation that put in place this year, and is due to come in place in July next year. The impact there is around the planning of that. So we've asked this question of both the Scottish Government and the UK Government: how does the deposit return system regulation interact with this? It looked as if in Scotland it wouldn't matter very much, because in Scotland the legislation was in place before the start of this. But actually, reading the clauses of the bill, it suggests that the restraint on trade, which won't be in place until later on, may actually be impacted by this legislation. And that would mean, from our reading, and obviously we need to get this confirmed by both governments, that bottles that were placed on the market in Scotland, which would have to follow a scheme and have labelling requirements and so on, cut that by placing bottles on the market in Scotland through this bill. So for me, there is a potential issue there. And there are, as I said, food legislation is a very complicated area, so there are likely to be numerous things that fly up that will be impacted by this. In the case of DRS, I think the internal market legislation actually makes that more complicated at the moment until we have an answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you. Dean Lockhart, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I would like to return to the question of how and when the internal market proposals might apply, because there's been a lot of hypothetical discussion around the scope of the internal market legislation, how much trade it will actually apply to, and the potential impact it will have on devolution. Now, I understand the panel's concerns and frustrations around the progress surrounding common frameworks, but the committee's heard evidence that they are progressing, and I think that was mentioned by a couple of the witnesses in this panel as well. Both governments do appear to be committed to having common frameworks in place to cover a number of areas, including agriculture, fisheries management, food standards and labelling, hopefully by the end of the year, at the end of the transition period. So can I ask the panel if those common frameworks are in place or almost in place with a view to being implemented, what levels of residual trade would the internal market provisions apply to, given that hopefully, most of those common frameworks will apply to the substance of the trades that we've been discussing? And perhaps I could start with Jonathan Hall and then move to David Thompson on that question.
Thanks, Dean. I think it would be quite a difficult challenge to estimate exactly how much of that residual trade, as you referred to, would be required to be covered by the non-discrimination mutual recognition proposals, because we still simply don't know exactly how many of the required common frameworks will be operational, and exactly how they will operate as such. I think if you look at agriculture alone, there isn't just a set of agricultural regulations. Agriculture is impacted by a whole host of different regulations for good reason in different ways. So whilst you might have an agricultural framework in place, I think a lot of that will surround issues of agricultural support and how that operates within an internal market to ensure that support payments don't cause a distortion to that internal market. But then you look at all sorts of other aspects of agricultural production, and they are governed by so many issues that cut across national boundaries in the UK, and so on. So, things like all the different elements of EU regulation that we currently have: Nitrates Directive, Water Framework Directive, everything to do with habitats and birds directives, as well, and that's before you get to food labelling and food safety issues, etc. Issues around organics, issues around GM and gene editing. So there's so many different interfaces of regulation that have an influence over agriculture. It's hard to quantify, certainly in my mind, exactly what might be left over that wouldn't be covered, because we still don't know exactly the full extent of what will be in place in terms of common frameworks by the time we get to 2021, or even partway through when we actually start to need them. Not a very helpful reply, I'm afraid.
It was helpful because I think it relates to the other question of, is this legislation in whatever form necessary? So it sounds like common frameworks and the best outcome will be in place, and we all want them, I think, to be as comprehensive as possible. But can they realistically, as you say, cover all 45 years of EU regulations in EU case law? And therefore, we kind of do have to have some form of fallback or sweep-up mechanism, which is the internal market bill.
I would tend to agree with that. As I've said already, you need that insurance policy somewhere. We don't want to use it, as far as I'm concerned. But given that we have an incredible array of complex regulations that we need to now stitch into commonly agreed approaches, and given the lack of progress, the frustrating lack of progress in that respect, it might be that in some areas, in order to maintain the smooth running of the free flow of goods and services within the UK internal market, that for some things you might rely on that mutual recognition, non-discrimination approach for a period.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate convener's time is tight. Perhaps I can ask David Thompson and then Professor Bell to come in on this question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jane. And maybe they could also say to us, what's the hurry? Yeah. Right, David.
What's the hurry? Sure. The main, as Johnny said, it's very difficult. We have not seen the agreements that are being developed. We've not been consulted on them. There's an enormous amount, a very small amount of time to get them in place, if you're looking for them to be in place by the 31st of December. There have been multiple years which this could have done. I know that the governments are working on a whole range of them, but the Scottish Government, I think, has resiled itself from the internal market discussions. So they're still in the balance as far as we're concerned, and we haven't seen the proof of the pudding. So that's the difficulty in then saying what else would be affected. But also, as I hope I outlined with the deposit return system comment, there are pieces of regulation which won't necessarily fall within these agreements and frameworks, and it's the interaction of those, in particular with this bill, that is very difficult to try and understand the impact of that going forward.
Thank you, David. And Professor Bell, I think you said in the chat box you would like to comment on this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm going to take a slightly different view and argue in a sense against myself in that there is one possible reason for immediately needing this bill, because the financial provisions effectively would allow the UK government to spend money across the devolved nations on whomever institution wants to do. And of course, EU regional funding is due to end very, very soon. And so the Shared Prosperity Fund, which has been talked about a lot, but has not really yet adopted any clear form, it has been promised, and therefore will need to be implemented very quickly. And if the internal market bill is, in a sense, a necessary precursor
for the shared prosperity fund. I mean, it does depend how it's going to be designed. There's no necessary need to follow the kind of design that the EU did, which was around having basically two large funds, the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund, and then handing these over and letting the different institutions, governments, subnational governments, make their own decisions on these. If there is going to be a sort of case-by-case approach along the lines of the UK city deals, then maybe the UK Internal Markets Bill is all that is needed to kick that shared prosperity fund into existence. And of course, there are a lot of people who have built up expertise and capacity around regional development, levelling up, that kind of agenda. And they are very anxious to know exactly how this fund is going to be designed.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Time is tight. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'll go to John Mason in a second, but can I ask a daft laddie question here? Why do we need an internal market bill for the UK government to create a shared prosperity fund and spend money?
I mean, it's only one clause.
Yeah, why is it needed? David, what's your response to that?
It is only one clause in the bill, which allows these spending powers. I mean, I have no clear understanding of why it was felt necessary to have this very large bill. And it was interesting that, again, that Bayes note does only refer to the Shared Prosperity Fund in terms of the application of the bill. The answer is maybe it's enabling, but the part that does the enabling is a pretty small part of the overall bill.
Okay, thanks. John Mason, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. I don't know that my video's on, is it?
We can hear you, John. Just keep going.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I mean, I was interested in that as well, because if the city, for Professor Bell, if the city deals could go ahead without legislation, presumably these could as well. And I mean, previously, Professor Bell, you said that, potentially the UK government could bypass the Scottish government and give money directly to Skills Development Scotland. The EU would not have done that, would they? They would only have done things in conjunction with the Scottish government?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so the Skills Development Scotland, is an agency of the Scottish government, and I think the money passes through Scottish government and then on to Skills Development Scotland, and then that has to be accounted for back to the EU that the funding has been used in a right and proper manner.
Okay, thanks. And the other question I was going to ask Professor Bell was, in your last paragraph of the paper you gave us, you said that it was somewhat surprising that procurement is not mentioned in the bill. So I was just going to ask you what's happening in that field.
Yeah, so I think procurement is very important, but it's going through the common frameworks approach. And as David and Jonathan have said, we're not really party to what's going on in the negotiations, but it's one of the common frameworks that's been being worked on, and it's important to know where this is going, because public procurement tends to be an important issue that appears in trade deals, because countries want access to other countries' public contracts markets. So the answer is it's on another track, and we really don't know where that track is leading at the moment.
I mean, it is quite an important issue, because, I mean, obviously, in some ways we would want to favour Scottish companies, but we don't want say, English regions to disadvantage Scottish companies. And I mean, you also mentioned the point about the living wage, because that's been a key, certainly political issue in Scotland, that we wanted to insist on the living wage, but the EU rules kind of precluded that. So do we not even have an indication that it might be more relaxed, or they might just copy?
Well, I don't know, and the Scottish Government is in these discussions, but we don't know much about what is going on within the common frameworks arrangements, and they go through various stages, and not many of them have gotten through all that many stages as yet. But it remains to be seen what will come out in the way that Scottish Government, can not favour Scottish companies, but can insist on certain conditions as far as those who win public contracts in Scotland is concerned.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think I just had one other question, which would be aimed at Mr. Hall. I mean, there appears to be a bit more freedom for Scotland to have its own animal health regulations and such like. And I was just wondering if you felt, Mr. Hall, that there was enough certainty on that, because I know we've had issues in the past, like transporting animals in Scotland because of the distances and the ferries. We've needed different rules from other countries, and I just wonder if you're comfortable with where we are on that at the moment.
I guess that illustrates the point about how we all need to operate to a basic level, a standard, in terms of animal, in this case, animal health, both in welfare and in disease terms. But then in certain situations, you do need that differentiation. So if you operated to exactly the same rules, absolutely uniformly applied, then that might be a disadvantage to one part of the UK over others, and it works in different ways. So having that devolved ability in that context remains pretty important. Very important indeed. You talk about animal transport issues there. If, for example, live transport over sea, or even in terms of time journeys, was to be an issue, and it was applied at a UK level, which has been mooted in many ways, that could be seriously threatening to the livestock industry in more peripheral parts of Scotland, simply because of the scale and distances of travel required. So it's things like that we have to preserve that ability to have a differentiated approach, whilst operating to a minimum standard that ensures animal health and welfare. But if you have a one-size-fits-all approach, then you do get these unintended consequences, whereby if you limited journey times to, say, 4 hours or less in total for livestock, then you would end up basically, livestock would be cleared from many parts of Scotland, because it would be unsustainable to breed animals in one part of Scotland and move them to other parts of Scotland, even to the point of slaughter.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, John. Can I warmly thank our witnesses for the evidence they've given us today. Again, we've covered a broad area of subjects. But just before we close the meeting, can I update colleagues on our invitation to the UK ministers to give evidence on the internal market bill that we've just been discussing? Although the media release we discussed previously was issued, I can now confirm the clerks have been advised by Mr. Gove, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster's office, that he's available to give evidence on the bill, and his officials will confirm timings with the clerks in due course. That's a welcome development, and I look forward to hearing from Mr. Gove, as I'm sure the rest of the committee will too. That being said, that now concludes our business for today, and I now close this meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Thank you to everyone who's involved, including the broadcasting teams. Thank you.